Hopefully it's the right one that you've signed up for. We're going to be looking at digital service standards. So we're joined by Kempster, who is the head of delivery for the centre, and also Maria Carnmo, who's a delivery lead for a project that we're running with Sports Wales. And we're delighted that Maria has brought two colleagues from Sports Wales along today as well. So Rebecca Pudsey and Stefan Barrow. So Anne, I'm going to hand to you to kick off the session, please.
Lovely, thank you very much. Hi, yes, I'm Anne Kempster. I'm head of delivery at the centre. Just a little bit about my team. So my wider team is working with all of our delivery partners. So we're working with 3 local authorities, Neath Port Talbot, Blaenau Gwent and Torfaen, on a service around accessing adult social care. We're working with Sport Wales, and we'll be hearing from that team a little bit later. We're also doing some work with Natural Resources Wales, Welsh Government, Welsh Revenue Authority, and starting to do some work as well with the Digital Services for Patients in Public programme, which sits within the Digital Health and Care Wales organisation, and much, much more. Can I have the next slide, please? The centre was formally launched in June 2020, and we're an arm's length body of the Welsh Government. We're here to support with the delivery of better public services in Wales. We work really closely with the chief digital officers in Welsh Government, local government and health to support delivery of the digital strategy for Wales. Can I have the next slide, please? Broadly, we do 3 things. So delivery is the first one of those, and we work with organisations across the public sector to support the delivery of better public services. This ranges from building multidisciplinary teams with organisations to working with them on digital transformation projects and providing advice and support and acting as a critical friend. We also do a strand on skills and capability, and this is where delivery and skills really cross over and come together. So paired working on projects from my teams are helping to transfer and build skills within organisations. We're also developing a more formal training offer for leaders and practitioners. And that offer has really been informed by working with a range of stakeholders across the public sector to help co-design the training format and the content with a real focus on people and not technology. In addition, we're also looking at how we start to develop a pipeline of talent for the future. We also focus on knowledge sharing, so we run these types of webinars and events. There's blog posts from our teams and from the wider organisation on what we're doing, and we're looking at connecting people inside and outside of Wales to learn from best practice and what's been done before. In addition, we're also setting up communities of practice. Can I have the next slide, please? So today's webinar is about the service standards and what's happened in this space since our last event on this in 2020. Can I have the next slide, please? So first, I want to talk about why we have standards. So service standards are here to help us describe what good looks like, to help create a consistency of experience for citizens, to develop high quality services, and to provide a way for teams to measure their progress. Standards are a core part of Mission 1 in the digital strategy for Wales, and they're at the heart of all the work that we do. Our forthcoming skills and capability offer will also be based around those standards. Next slide, please. So last year we shared a draft set of standards, and there were 10 of those standards. Those were influenced heavily by service standards that have been developed previously by the UK Government Digital Service, and drawing on their standards, which have existed and changed since they were launched in 2013, and have been through a lot of testing through sort of real hands-on use. Our first draft included 2 Wales-specific standards, focusing on the current and future well-being of the people of Wales and promoting the Welsh language. In March this year, we reviewed our draft standards. We spoke to teams across the public sector about how they were starting to use the standards in their work, to identify what might be missing, to understand what else was needed to help them really start to embed those standards within their organisations. We also talked to other governments, particularly Canada, about their experience of developing and embedding standards in a bilingual country. We also spoke to the Scottish Digital Service about the recent refresh that they did to their standards. This review led to us drafting an updated version, which is what's published on our website now. Next slide, please. So we now have 12 standards, and those standards are clustered around 3 themes. So that's meeting user needs, creating good digital teams, and using the right data and technology. Additionally, we've added 2 new standards, and refined the other 10 from the first draft. And again, we've drawn heavily on the good work that has come before from GDS, Scotland, and further afield. And most importantly, we've kept our 2 uniquely Welsh standards. Can I have the next slide, please? So we're going to run through each of the standards in a bit more detail, and I'll talk about what they mean, some of the things that teams might want to be thinking about as they start to approach each standard. So the first standard focuses on the current and future well-being of people in Wales. So we're here to make a positive difference to the lives of people in Wales, and we should be driven by outcomes that benefit them, not by lists of technical specifications or requirements. Digital service design means that thinking about the future as much as what we think about today. So services should contribute to the 7 goals of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. And some of the things that teams might want to be thinking about with this standard is, are the services that they're creating sustainable? Who will own, develop, and maintain the service in the long run? What's the environmental impact of the technology running them? And how do we make sure that the digital services that we're developing contribute to a more equitable Wales? Next slide, please. So standard 2 is promote the Welsh language. So services in Wales should meet the needs of people who use the Welsh language in their everyday lives. Teams should design and build services that promote and facilitate the Welsh language and treat users who speak it equally with those who prefer English. The standard takes us beyond just translating English content into Welsh, but helps teams to think about how to design truly, deeply bilingual services that work for everyone. Next slide, please. Standard 3, user needs to drive service design, whoever users are. Users need to make more of the, user needs matter more than the constraints of business structures, organizational silos, or technologies. This will mean a new set of skills for researchers and new roles within teams with these specialist user research skills. Next slide. Standard 4 is around providing a joined up service. So the services we deliver should work seamlessly across all channels, online and offline, and across organizations to make sure that users have a joined up and coherent experience. Internal teams and processes should be organized to better support the service and meet user needs across their entire journey. So this will often mean that organizations need to start thinking about how teams are structured and funded based around services and not internal organizational structures with silos and divides between teams. Next slide, please. Standard 5 says that we should make sure that everyone can use the service. So there's usually no alternative to using public services, so they have to work for everyone. You should design your service to be inclusive, making sure that anyone who needs to use it can do so as easily as possible. Designing services with users who tend to be excluded in mind often makes them better for everyone. So this standard is really around accessibility in its widest sense and digital inclusion. So how can someone access the service if they're struggling to access the internet? And how can we design services that work for people with limited access to data or bandwidth of their Wi-Fi? Next slide, please. Standard 6 is having an empowered service owner. So there should be a single empowered service owner who has the authority and responsibility to make all business, product, and technical decisions about a service. And the same person is accountable and responsible for how well the service meets the needs of its users, which is how its success will be evaluated. Next slide, please. Standard 7 is having a multidisciplinary team. So teams are how we build services, and each team should be a diverse mix of people, experience, expertise, and disciplines. As well as having the right mix of skills and experience for the current stage of development, the team should be able to explain how the makeup of the team may change over time and what funding will be needed to support a team responsible for the service's continuous improvement. So multidisciplinary teams are more than just one of each of the digital roles that we're becoming used to, but they also include operations, procurement, communications, and HR. And more importantly, they should really include subject matter experts in them as well. Next slide, please. Standard 8 is iterate and improve frequently. So we should use incremental, fast-paced development approaches to get working software into users' hands as early as possible and as often as possible. This will help teams rapidly iterate based on user feedback. Next slide, please. Standard 9 is working in the open. We should aim to make the services we build and the techniques we use to build them as open as possible. As they develop a service, teams should communicate in the open about the decisions they're making and what they're learning. They should also share code, patterns, and insights as freely as possible to help others seeking to build excellent public services in Wales. So this is things like sharing week notes widely within and outside of organizations, publishing blog posts, speaking at events about the work that you're doing, talking about how you're doing what you're doing, why you're doing things, and the decisions that you're making as you do them. This isn't about making announcements after something has been done. Next slide, please. Standard 7 moves into our technology standards, and this is using scalable technology. So we should make technology decisions that help teams do their work and deliver. They should always aim to use the simplest, most appropriate tool and avoid vendor lock-in to specific technologies. Teams should be empowered to use the tools that work for them and encouraged to consider tools that meet open standards, are cloud-based, and have widespread adoption and support. Next slide, please. Standard 11 is asking teams to consider ethics, privacy, and security throughout building a service. So digital services must protect sensitive information and keep data secure. Teams should assess, understand, and address ethical issues associated with all digital services at every stage of their development. And I particularly like the inclusion of ethics into the standard, as it's something that we have overlooked far too much in the past in the development of digital products and services in both the public and the private sector. Next slide, please. Standard 12 is use data to make decisions. We should constantly measure how well services are performing for users. Teams should use performance data to find and prioritize improvements. Where possible, that data should be automated and real-time to make it objective and easy to collect. Teams should conduct user research on iterative changes to their services, and senior leaders should take part in research on a regular basis to stay in touch with the work. Next slide, please. I'm now going to hand over to Maria and the Sport Wales team to talk about how they've been starting to think through the standards in the discovery work that they've been doing.
Thanks, Anne, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm Maria Carmo, and I was part of the Sport Wales Discovery team as an Agile coach. As you can see on the screen, this was the whole team who delivered the Sport Wales Discovery work. And today, I'm joined by Becca and Steph representing the team. Next slide, please. So as way of a quick background, Sport Wales and the Centre partnered with a multidisciplinary team of 6 people, as you've seen, and of which we are part. We worked on an 8-week discovery, which finished on the 3rd of September, so only a couple of weeks ago. And during those 8 weeks, we explored how can Sport Wales increase the reach and the impact of that community investment of grants. Although the amount of work and the timings were quite challenging, especially considering that we were working 4 days a week, we still thought it'd be really important to consider how we fared against digital service standards for Wales. So I'd say maybe think of the standards as a guiding light. And I would definitely recommend for all teams to spend some time at the beginning of a piece of work to see how the 12 principles could help or improve what you do and how you do it. And obviously, we'll continue to use the standards as we move forward. And I'll pass on to Becca now.
Thanks, Maria. Hi, I'm Rebecca from Sport Wales. So during our second weekly retrospective, or retro for sport, for short, in which we reflect as a team on how we can improve together, we took some time to discuss the standards. As you can see, if we can have the next slide, please. As you can see, we went through and we categorised the standards into we're doing it, we're not doing it, and review at a later date. And we considered each in turn and their appropriateness within our discovery phase. We felt we were already aligned to most of the standards. However, we did choose to stick a pin, as it were, in number 10, which is use of scalable technology, as this will be explored further in the later phases when we specifically look at our IT system that underpins our investment work. However, we will reconsider all the standards again when starting the alpha phase. 2 of the standards that we would like to discuss further with you today are promoting the Welsh language and understand users and their needs. If we could have the next slide, please. Thank you. So when it came to promoting the Welsh language, we felt that we were already doing this by undertaking the discovery phase bilingually. So that included all of our surveys being designed in English and in Welsh, as well as our interviews and blog posts all from the start. Our user researcher, Alice, is a fluent Welsh speaker, and she was invaluable to helping us with this approach. She did a lot of the translations and any of the interviews that wished to be conducted in Welsh. She also did those as well. When discussing this standard, it did prompt us to think about how many applications Sport Wales currently has in the Welsh language. And when looking through the stats of our current grant, which is the Be Active Wales Fund, we saw that there was actually less than 1% of our applications are submitted in Welsh. In terms of the context of our delivery work, discovery work, we thought that the word promote felt a bit too much like it was like a marketing word as opposed to what we were trying to achieve, and maybe rephrasing it to make it more clear that the standard is to design bilingual services would be helpful to other teams as they go through the process. If you could go to the next slide, and I will hand over to my colleague Steph, who will talk about the other standards that we looked at as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca, and good afternoon, everybody. So speaking to the standard of understanding users and their needs. Understanding users and their needs, in fact, has been at the heart of everything we've done in Discovery over the past 8 weeks. And the first exercise that we embarked on as a team was trying to understand who our users are or were. So very briefly, we broke those down into 3 groups. The first being people who had, or clubs, organisations who had applied to funding to Sport Wales previously and who had been successful. The second group was people or clubs or organisations who had applied to Sport Wales previously but had been unsuccessful. Then we had a third group of users that we identified, and we called them potential users. So those being clubs, organisations, community groups who we thought could benefit from Sport Wales funding, but for one reason or another haven't made contact with Sport Wales or haven't applied for funding from Sport Wales in previous years. So once we'd gone through that exercise of establishing who our users were, we then wanted to understand what their needs and desires were. And as already been mentioned, we made contact with each of those groups, either directly or indirectly, via surveys and interviews to get to the point where we could understand their needs. We paid careful attention along the way when communicating with those groups to make sure we really did dig deep and understand what their needs were and what support and improvements they would suggest as potential users. Now, reflecting on this standard made us check and challenge ourselves from the outset, really, and ensure that as a group we were really all about understanding who our users were and what their needs were from our funding streams. Next slide, please. And very briefly, we just wanted to share this slide with you, which provides a couple of quotes from our users. I'll leave you read them just for 1 second. And the point of sharing these quotes with you was really to help you realise that, and it made us realise that without reaching out to users, without understanding who they were and what their needs were, we would have never understood or got to grips with these sort of perspectives from our users. So it's a worthwhile reminder of the importance then of us reaching out and understanding who they are and what they want from us. Thank you. I'll pass over to Anne.
Thanks. Can I have the next slide, please? Just to say that this is just the start of what we're going to be doing in the space with standards. Later this week, we'll be re-advertising a head of standards role to lead this whole area and the work that needs to come out of this. So we'll be looking for candidates who have deep experience of designing, developing and delivering digital services to a set of recognised standards. Someone who's passionate about why standards are important to good service delivery. We're also setting up a standards board with the CDOs from Welsh Government, local government, health and our CEO at the centre. And this board will look at the range of standards that currently exist. We'll work to identify commonalities and gaps and move towards an endorsed set of standards that work for the whole of the public sector. The board will also discuss what level of control, if any, is needed to embed standards in organisations. And next, our head of standards is going to come into a couple of big things on their plate, which includes kicking off a discovery to look at what a supportive, light touch assurance process could look like, which will help and support teams to measure their progress against the 12 standards. And closely linked to this will be the development of a fuller service manual that helps teams understand what they need to be doing and thinking about at each stage of the agile cycle. So what things that you need to think about at discovery, at alpha, at beta and live. And as I think as the Sport Wales team talked about, some of the standards are more and less applicable at different stages of development, and I think some additional guidance would be really helpful for people. And finally, we're continuing to embed the standards in our procurement processes, and we'll be looking at how we can support suppliers to understand the standards and how they can help teams meet them, and the skills and capabilities that their teams will need to have to be able to do this. Thank you very much.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Anne, and to the other speakers as well. Anne, do you want to pick up on the point that you've just put in the chat as well, in case people were too busy listening to the speakers and haven't picked up on that point? So the point around what Rebecca said about the Welsh language standard and the language that Sport Wales looked at when using that.
So it was really interesting to hear how the team approached that standard and the feedback that they had around that. Something we'll be testing with other projects and with other organisations to see how the phrasing of that standard works. And we'll work really closely with Jeremy Evas, his team, and the wider Welsh language community of practice if we need to iterate and refine the wording of that standard to make it clearer for people to understand the intent behind that and the intent around bilingual service design.
Lovely, thank you. We've got a couple of questions here, a couple of anonymous questions, but we also have one from Ian Vaughan. So Ian, if we take you off mute now, are you able to put your question to Anne? It's around a technological code of practice. There we go.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah. Thanks, Anne, for the update. It's really interesting work. It's just a follow-up question. Do you have any plans for a technology code of practice in Wales in conjunction with the service standard that you're creating?
Thanks, Ian. It's a really good question. I think as I was mentioning about the work of the Standards Board and the head of standards coming in, looking at those where we have gaps and where we have sort of overlap and complementary things. I think for me, we very much need to look at what we provide around standards in the technology space, whether that's a code of practice or whether that's a set of specific technology standards, I think is something we'll work through over coming months with a head of standards and with a wider public sector leadership in that space as well.
Yeah, okay. And I just,
but in lieu of there being anything, I think the tech code of practice at UK level is a really good starting point to use if you need something to base something around in your organisation.
Okay, and I just got one follow-up question, if that's okay, in terms of assessments and how you plan to embed this in organisations. So the link in the standards to controls, do you have any thoughts on how best to approach that yet? Because the central government from GDS is all linked to spend control. So how do you plan to embed the standards in organisations?
Yep. I think I certainly have my personal opinions around some of this, but I don't think we've worked up a sort of formal approach across the other CDOs and leaders yet. We're having some very early discussions, but as the Standards Board starts to come into play, they'll start looking at those issues specifically. I think it's just worth mentioning that there are other levers that UK government level has as well around this, not just spend controls. So if you want to put a service live at UK government level, you have to go through a process of requesting a domain, and that's another point at which we can make sure that things are going through an appropriate standards assessment as well.
Great, thanks, I appreciate it.
Lovely. So there's two linked questions here. So Anne, can you give us a bit more information in terms of the key things that came out of the review earlier this year? Because Andrew Strong is also asking about, what were the two new standards when you iterated? So you said there was 10 and we've ended up with 12. So can you give us a little bit more information about that, please?
Yes, absolutely, and apologies that I didn't run through that earlier. So standard 4, which is provided joined up experience, which is making sure that people experience their offline and online parts of their journey through a service in the same way, was an addition, and we borrowed that very heavily from GDS. And also point 5, which is making sure that everyone can use the service. That was the other additional new one, and that's really focused very heavily on inclusion and accessibility. And we've worked really closely with our colleagues in Welsh Government within the Office for the Chief Digital Officer, as well as in the digital inclusion team, to develop and refine the guidance that will sit behind that standard as well.
Andrew, I hope that's answered your question. If not, just pop it back into the chat, but hopefully that has. If you've got any questions, please either raise your hand or pop them into the chat function. And we've got a question here. Do we have any idea about how many organisations have been designing services to the standards here in Wales so far? Key lessons learned, and I suppose a little bit more information about if an organisation did want to trial or adopt these standards, how would they go about doing it?
So I think we're in the early stages of starting to get an understanding of who's using these standards or the previous standards sort of from GDS side of things. The landscape review that we're conducting, which you can read more about on our blog, is using these standards to start to measure services against as they're finding out data. So we are starting to get a sense that organizations are starting to develop services that are in line with the service standard. They're not necessarily consciously using that standard yet, but there's some really positive signs there. And as we've been sort of meeting organizations across the public sector, there's a real appetite for wanting to move towards using standards. I think the gap that we have is that next level of guidance that I mentioned earlier around what you need at specific stages of this, and some sense of how you measure your progress against this as well. I think that's, for me, that's one of the things that is currently lacking with the standards as they are.
Great, thank you. Another anonymous question here. So regarding Standard 11, how will this standard improve the use, reuse and discoverability of data both internally and externally? Lots of data held by public bodies that is duplicated in different silos, is unstructured and sits disparately and within closed systems. Publishing data requests and making it available is often a person's job as opposed to it being automated. So just your thoughts on that, please.
So I think there's the start of some wider work happening in the data space more generally around looking at developing a set of standards for the public sector around use and reuse of data. I don't have a lot more at this point that I can add to that one, but it is definitely something that we are looking at and something that we know that we urgently need to start addressing.
And we have another question here. So can you talk about the work on converging service standards, digital or otherwise? And is there an expectation that all sectors in public service adhere to them? So for example, NHS England have created an NHS version of the service standard. Is this the strategy for Wales where they may become sector specific versions? So thoughts on that, please.
Yeah, so this will be one of the things that the standards board and the head of standards starts to look at really early on, to start to do a review of what already exists. Do we need to have sector specific standards? Are we in danger of having too many standards if we start to do that? I think they're all very good questions and something we know we need to start working through and are moving in that direction, but we're not quite there yet.
The head of standards is going to be a very busy person as they come on board. Yeah. So once the job description and job pack is out, we would encourage and appreciate if you could share it as far and wide as possible. A question for the Sports Wales team. So you said that you reviewed the standards and had a discussion about which ones you met, which ones you didn't, and which ones you were popping a pin in. Which ones were more difficult from your point of view, would you say? Who'd like to take that?
Maybe I can start and maybe then the team can give their views as well. So for instance, when we went through the 12 standards, for instance, some of them, it seemed kind of we were doing, black and white. For instance, if you think about standard 7, which is have a multidisciplinary team. So basically that's how we were constructed anyway. So then we as a team would be responsible for delivering that piece of work. But as well, like Becca said previously, some other ones felt like during discovery was something that might not be necessarily at the forefront what we were doing. We were thinking about it when we were looking at the current system internally, the grants, and we were talking and trying to start, I think, to understand what the system could potentially not offer, but how potentially flexible it could be, but definitely will be something that we will be considering a lot more during Alpha. I don't know if Becca or Steph, you want to step in?
Yeah, I'd have to agree with Maria that I suppose the third theme of using the right data and technology was the slightly more difficult ones when we were going through it, because we just weren't at that stage yet. But, you know, it is something that we will reconsider through Alpha, and we'll probably be in a better position to ensure that we're meeting those ones as part of the next phases rather than discovery so much.
Thank you, folks. And that links to Anne's point about guidance and support on various stages of the Agile programme, so you won't necessarily need to look at them all up front. Ben has just popped a comment in the chat asking about where should someone who's interested in the data side of things look to keep on track of this. And Anne has said Welsh Government will be leading on this. I'd expect them to start blogging, talking about this soon. So working in the open. Lovely. Thank you for that, Anne. A couple more anonymous. I hope I'm doing your questions justice when they're anonymous. We can't bring you in. So if I am not doing it justice, or you would like clarification, obviously just come back and let us know. So we have a question here. Are there plans for a set of standards to be issued to third sector organisations delivering public services? Anne?
I don't think we would issue a separate set of standards, but we'd really love to work with third sector organisations to understand how the existing 12 service standards would work for them, and to help them support them move in the direction of adhering to them.
Yeah, and somebody else has asked about a community of practice around standards. I think, you know, as more organisations move to adopting them, the ability to be able to share learning and experience in terms of how they're working would be really beneficial. So any plans, Anne, based on that from the Centre's point of view?
Yeah, so it was something that we certainly talked about with organisations and put some feelers out when we were doing the review back in March. Some of you may have seen some of the blog posts around that. In lieu of having a head of standards who we're making a very, very busy job for indeed, I think setting that up, whether that's around all of the standards as a whole, or whether there's more of an appetite around particular standards, is something that they'll be looking at. But we should mention that we have 2 communities of practice running already. One of those relates to the second service standard, which is around the Welsh language, and they're incredibly active, an amazing community that have come together really early on, and also a community of practice around communicating as well. So really driving that working in the open approach as well. And we can share more details of both of those in chat if anyone's interested in getting involved in those. And if you want to be involved in a future community of practice broadly around the standards, I would say also drop your details in chat or email the centre, and we will keep you on a list for when the head of standards starts.
We will do. And a segue into the next community of practice, looking at communicating digital. We're going to be hearing from Anne-Louise Clark, who's the Exec Director of Communications and Change at Audit Wales, and she's going to be talking about their approach to working in the open. So Gemma will pop the link into the chat now if you want to book onto that. That's next Wednesday, 1 to 2. The bilingual Building Bilingual Digital Services is every 2 weeks, and the next one's on the 30th of September. So yeah, pop your details in the chat and we'll get more information to you about that. A question here for Sports Wales. So you've obviously been working closely with the centre on the discovery and moving into the next phase. So somebody has asked, how have you as an organisation gone about changing the organisation? So in particular, how are you building capacity and capability for doing work around service design and this approach? So who would like to take that?
I'll start off, if that's right. Beck maybe can jump in. I think Beck would agree with me that the organisation, Sport Wales itself, have been really accommodating and really good in making sure that both Beck and I, our workload from a Sport Wales point of view has been taken away and dealt with elsewhere. And that's where it's allowed sort of our capacity then to work on this project and to work through discovery very closely with Maria and the team. So I think that the major point that comes to mind for me is how accommodating Sport Wales themselves have been in making sure that all the background stuff is taken away from us so that we can have sort of that focus and that energy to focus on this. I don't know, Bex, if you want to jump in with anything else.
No, just to say that I agree with what Steph has said. It's definitely been much easier to really focus on a specific piece of work without having to have the pulls of, you know, all your other work or your other emails as you normally would. So from that perspective, it's been really good. And I know that as part of some of the sessions that we've been doing internally, we've done some like drop-in sessions so that people can just get an understanding of what it is that we're doing, as opposed to the more formal like show and tell sessions. It's been really well received in terms of other parts of the organisation, maybe who aren't involved in our community investments, and they really would like to know more about how we've gone about building the capacity to do this piece of work as well. So it's something that Sport Wales wants to continue doing as well. So it's been a really positive experience in that respect, not just for us, but hopefully for other people in the organisation when they're doing pieces of work that they really want to focus on as well.
Yeah, and great to be released from the day job to be able to focus on that. If people are interested in terms of the discovery phase in more detail, we have done a couple of sessions which have been recorded. And I know Maria is currently doing a blog in terms of wrapping up the 8-week discovery phase and what the findings were and what they're going to do going forward. So if you're interested, we can send some details about that or just pop on the website and have a look. 2 more questions then. So Anne, you mentioned about the skills and capability work, and that being one of our key focus, and it's great to have Peter on the call or on the webinar as well. So Peter joined us as the head of skills and capability a couple of weeks ago. So how do the standards fit into the skills and capability work you mentioned, Anne?
I wondered if we could bring Peter in to answer that, if we could give him that opportunity.
Yep. He's on his way.
Hello.
Hello, Peter. So the question was, how do the standards fit into the skills and capability work that Anne mentioned?
That's a very good question, and one that's being deeply considered at the moment, to be honest. We were really keen to embed the standards in all that we do. The skills and capability work is new to me. We literally 3rd week now, but we're looking at using a user-focused approach to bring in training courses online early on for people who are already considering agile ways of working, looking at user-centered design and such. So part of our standards there, people are already looking at that. We'll have some training courses up and running in the next month or so. And then we are literally in the process of looking at how to first structure a digital skills academy. So a long-term vision is to set up some training and support. Importantly, it's not just come on a course and then, sit there for an afternoon, have a lovely time and go back to work as normal. It's about building capacity to go back into an organization that's ready to accept you. All the training, as part of the academy will be aligned to the service standards in that sense. So working very, very closely at the moment with some colleagues to decide how we set up that academy and what it's going to look like. And by colleagues, I mean, we are literally co-creating the training based on needs of people across the public sector at the moment. So I think long answer, but in summary, the service standards are key and right in the middle of our skills and capability plans.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Peter. And we have another question here. Somebody's asking, so if we start using the standards, how will we know whether we are succeeding and if they're making a difference? Is this where assessments come in? Will those provide guidance as well as the assessments themselves? So Anne, can you talk us through a little bit more about assurance process and assessment, although it's probably early days?
So I think in answer to the first part, in lieu of having a formal assessment process at the moment or any further guidance, I think myself and my team would be happy to spend a bit of time having some conversations with people, talking through the standards, talking through how you're working and what that's sort of shaping up like, to start to at least give an indication of direction of travel. But following on from that, as I mentioned earlier, we will be developing some guidance to help teams understand what each of those standards means as they go along and how they would measure their progress against that. I think it's really important that standards are measurable, so you know if you're achieving and moving in the right direction.
Great. Lovely. So final call for questions. Are there any more for any more? So there's a comment for you there in the chat. Peter, any other questions? I'll just scroll back. No. No more. Okay. I think we've exhausted the questions that we've had. Some great questions there. So just to say a big thank you for joining us at the session today, and also a big thank you to our speakers, Anne, Maria, Rebecca and Stefan, and thank you to all of you for posing the questions that you've had. If you think of any outside of the webinar, do feel free to drop us a line and we will answer your question if we can. This will be recorded, as I said initially, and it'll be posted on our website along with on social media as well. So if you want to revisit any of it, you can go back and watch it again, or do please feel free to share it within your organizations as well. If you have any feedback on the sessions, please do drop us a line. You can contact us on Twitter or on LinkedIn, and you can also sign up to our newsletter to get all of the information on the upcoming events. The plan is to run these monthly, and they will be aligned with the standards as well. So do keep an eye on future events. So just to say a big thank you to you all. Diolch yn fawr iawn, and we will see you next month. Take care.